Venezuela's allies Russia and China sparred with the U.S. at a meeting of the United Nations Security Council in New York, accusing Washington of, quote, cowboy behavior for its military and economic pressure on Caracas. The U.S. has ramped up its military presence in the Caribbean, with President Trump announcing a naval blockade. So far this month, the U.S. Coast Guard has intercepted 2 tankers loaded with Venezuelan crude. U.S. Ambassador Mike Waltz said Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro's ability to sell oil was enabling narcoterrorist activities. Waltz also said Maduro had stolen the election, which gave him his mandate.
President Trump has been very clear that he is going to use the full power of the United States of America, the full might of the United States, to take on and eradicate these drug cartels which have operated with impunity in our hemisphere for far too long, and everyone knows it. The single most serious threat to this hemisphere, our very own neighborhood, and the United States, is from transnational terrorists and criminal groups.
And with me now is Alan Weiner. He's a scholar of international law at Stanford Law School. Alan, we just heard U.S. Ambassador Waltz saying the U.S. has to protect its hemisphere from Venezuela and from its alleged support for drug cartels. Do you see any legal basis for U.S. actions, including intercepting oil tankers in international waters?
Well, there are a number of different issues here. I mean, clearly, the threat to engage in regime change is difficult to defend under international law. The Maduro regime, although it is illegitimate, I think there's very little doubt that the elections that Maduro has relied on to keep him in power were fraudulently recorded. That is not, however, the basis for invading a country under international law. We're only allowed to use force in self-defense if we've sustained an armed attack. And I think it's quite clear that even the allegedly dangerous activities that Venezuelan drug groups are engaged in, drug gangs, Tren de la Ragua, would not qualify as an armed attack, which would justify the use of force. So on the question of the use of force or the threat to use force, I think here it's quite clear that there's not a legal basis for what the Trump administration is doing, nor is there a legal basis for the attacks that we've seen on the vessels, on the boats that are allegedly involved in ferrying drugs from Venezuela or through points to the United States. The situation with the tankers is a little bit more complicated. It is U.S. practice to impose sanctions, and we apply sanctions extraterritorially for violations of international law that other countries have engaged in. And I think these are vessels that, as near as we can tell, these tankers that have been intercepted are, they're not flag vessels. They're not bearing the flag of any particular state. They're trying to be clandestine vessels, and they're being intercepted on the high seas. And if they are engaged in the transshipment of fuel between Venezuela and Iran that the United States has subjected to sanctions, then it may be possible, there's a debate among legal scholars, but it may be permissible for the United States to exercise jurisdiction and to seize those vessels.
So you're saying that the U.S. can possibly enforce its sanctions on the high seas, but that's a controversial point.
There are different views among different scholars. Some take a narrower view, and others take a more expansive view. But if we think about another conflict, in Europe, of course, there's been a hot debate in the past months about the seizure of Russian assets. And of course, here, European countries have frozen Russian assets by virtue of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which of course is something that has taken place outside the territory of the countries where the assets have been seized. So this kind of assertion of jurisdiction over assets because of things that they've done impermissibly or that a country believes is illegal in its own territory, I mean, there is precedent for this. The U.S. has tended to be more expansive in terms of its assertion of jurisdiction than many other countries. And so there will be debate about this.
Let's talk a little bit about tonight's emergency meeting at the UN Security Council. Venezuela's allies, Russia and China, backed this meeting on the request of Venezuela. Both Moscow and Beijing accusing the U.S. of intimidation. What's your takeaway from tonight's Security Council meeting?
Well, it's not surprising that the Security Council is gridlocked on this issue. Venezuela has formed closer relations with Cuba, with Iran. That in turn has led them to tighter connections with China and Russia as a counterweight to the United States. Of course, the Security Council, one of the things I thought was interesting is that there was objection on the part of countries that are sympathetic to Venezuela to U.S. policy, really not so much an allegation that what the United States was necessarily doing was illegal. We also saw some countries, including other Latin American countries, Argentina now rallying to the defense of the Trump administration's behavior as some of the countries in Latin America drift to the right. Of course, we know that for the Security Council to actually take action, to exercise its legal powers to adopt a resolution that would have legal effect, that requires essentially unanimity among the permanent 5 members, Russia, China, the UK, France, and the United States. These countries have been gridlocked not only on the Venezuela issue, but on all important foreign policy issues for at least 5 to 10 years now. And so this is a chance for states to express their views and their opinions. The reality is that the Trump administration, by virtue of its buildup of military assets in the Caribbean and the Pacific, will be the one making the decisions in the region.
Alan Weiner, international legal scholar from Stanford Law School. Thank you for your assessments.
Thanks for having me.